Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. So, today we're at least at the start of this episode going to talk about the recent presidential debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden and some thoughts that both of us had on it. So, I just wanted to start by kind of giving an overview of what I was thinking while I watched it and then just some broad takeaways I had. So, first off, if you haven't watched the debate yet, I'm not going to recommend it. I'm also going to not tell you to not watch it because it is a spectacle for better or worse. I don't think anybody has said anything particularly positive about the debate to this point. If that's any bellwether of the quality that of the debate, I was actually pretty entertained for the first half hour, but it was already going downhill and it got hard to watch instead of kind of funny to watch. But one of the things that I found so compelling about it was how blatant it was that neither of the candidates really had anything of value to say and how little substance was discussed. I was almost surprised after the fact that I saw CNN fact check certain parts of what Trump had to say because there were so little concrete things discussed in the whole debate that I was surprised fact checking could really even occur on any statement either person really made. That's how I guess it lacked such substance, and all of it was just crosstalk and ad hominems for the overwhelming majority. Now, I think it's interesting to talk about this debate in a couple, I guess, more meta ways. So I think it's kind of fascinating how clear it was that it was a stupid conversation that would make everybody who was watching dumber if they were remotely informed. And it would be hard for somebody who is uninformed to walk into that first presidential debate and actually understand what either candidate really stood for the most part. And to even make sense of some of it, some things they touched on, you already had to have a working knowledge, which kind of just reveals how bad the debate was at doing its job. Now, this is interesting because most debates kind of, to some extent, do the opposite, where they have a cover of decency and respectability, and they pretend to be these like cavalier statesmen, and then they kind of talk policy in a way that's almost pseudo intellectual, but they try to bring it down to the regular discourse. And I feel like in those debates, you could argue those candidates aren't saying anything of value, but they're at least putting up this facade that they are. Um, and this debate was truly noteworthy because that facade wasn't, they dropped that immediately and it was just straight to yelling at each other. So I think it's kind of just fascinating to take a minute and talk about how you reacted because I'm coming obviously from a more cynical perspective, knowing that I'm not going to vote and kind of laughing at the show of it. And you're at least going to participate in the democratic system. But a couple other things I just want to note that are kind of some big picture things about the debate was after this debate occurred, Jo Jorgensen's website ended up crashing. She's the LP candidate, for the Libertarian Party, and that's just because like people were trying to make a trend like that she won the debate just because she wasn't there to look bad because those two candidates looked so bad. And then at least she kind of also puts on the facade of substance. She is running on like a serious campaign that wants to talk about issues, which she does much more effectively than Biden and Trump both did. The other thing I would say is I know it's not scientific to talk about focus groups because they are a very small sample, but there was one reporter who had he posted on Twitter that his focus group of the undecided voters going into the debate, 1/3 of those people said they were less likely to vote at all after the debate. Which me as a person who likes seeing our institutions decayed, that's like a theme we keep hitting on from episode to episode. I like that. I kind of like hearing that it was such a bad show that it's making these normal people lose faith in democracy, and it's not just people like me who are, down on the system. So I guess that's my overview, and that's some of my meta takeaways. So do you want to give your overview, and then maybe we can jump into specific moments that caught our eye?
Yeah, so I guess I want to begin my overview with kind of just a preface. You already know this, but I'm just kind of going to explain something to the audience really quickly. I was a bit unsure if I wanted to talk about the debate, mainly because what I heard you saying, and correct me if I was misinterpreting it, but I heard you saying you were viewing it through your critique of democracy as a whole, and I was just not sure. I'm still not sure if a presidential debate is a good jumping off point for a conversation about the pros and cons of democracy. I'm sure we'll touch on it here and there, but that won't be my main. That won't be the main point I'm making. The points I'm making will be a bit different and a bit more specific. So the format of the presidential debate is, and I came up with this term. I don't know if anyone's used this term before, or if I just came up with it and I'm such a genius. But I would describe them as TV-esque. So in other words, the presidential debates are very they basically like think about the negative stereotypes that television has, or think about these very basic critiques of just television and the format, and how television's panders to the lowest common denominator, how television is dumb, how television rots your brain, and so on and so forth. I think that presidential debates basically embody all the worst aspects of television in some ways, because they shouldn't be called debates at all. It's theater. The two candidates, they're performing. They're not making arguments. They're not trying to persuade. Well, they might be trying to persuade, but they're not trying to persuade with evidence and with logic and with carefully constructed analysis of the issues that we face nowadays. They are out there to make themselves look as good as can be, and make the other opponent look as bad as they can do, as bad as they can make them look. But it's not, as you said, there's no substance behind it. And I think that's true for even presidential debates that are considered, civil. I think that there's no substance behind that either. I would be willing, in fact, I would probably want, like the concept of a presidential debate, I'm not opposed to. But I think the format of the debate is just so far off base that it is at best unhelpful, and at worst detrimental to the political process as a whole. So I guess I would just add, I would much rather see perhaps even just a conversation, two people two people running for president. They don't even have to have podiums and necessarily be like a formal debate. We can have formal debates, and if we did, then both presidential candidates would have failed to follow the basic rules of an actual debate. But I think I would almost prefer just a regular conversation between the two presidential candidates about the various issues. And you can have somebody there to, occasionally chip in with the next topic, or maybe with an insightful question, or just to make sure people, the debaters or the conversationalists, stay on topic and try and stay somewhat respectful at least. But whatever we have now, or whatever presidential debates are now, they're worthless. And this one was just especially painful to watch.
Yeah, it is kind of in the format of imagine when they bring on somebody on MSNBC or on CNN during the daytime, where they'll bring on the token Republican versus the in-house Democrat, and then they pose a question, and those people talk over each other about 20% of the time, and then each of them can make their point for about 40%, but they're at best making the surface level case because they have such little time to talk about the topic. So that's kind of what you got here, except you got even more crosstalk, and it was, poorly moderated, and it didn't help that it was live and continuous, because at least those segments get broken up by commercials, and it was only one 5-minute segment between two antagonistic parties. This had no commercials, and it was an hour and a half straight. So of course they only got more antagonistic, and they both got less functional in terms of thinking capacity. So yeah, it was very much like that low form of TV, especially cable news opinion TV, that is often criticized. I think the ideal way to do it would be something along the lines of the questions are posed to the candidates and they get the same question, like, hey, here's the same setup about the economy. What economic plans would you like to see implemented? And then they would both like simultaneously have them recorded in different rooms, and then they would also get shown the other person's video afterwards, and then get a chance to rebuttal, maybe something like that. Because then you can't talk over the person, and you have to give a off the top of your head a real answer of substance, because you have to answer for a couple minutes hypothetically. You'd want to get your point across. Maybe something like that. But well, there is one virtue of having a presidential debate. And it only came up one time that I noticed, where it was something was said that I've been thinking, and it was like, whoa, a candidate actually said that. And it could only happen because they were both, on the stage at the same time. And one of the things that Joe Biden's pushing right now is he pretty much, blames the economic collapse during coronavirus on Donald Trump. And to me, that seems pretty unfounded, because Joe Biden, he won't even blame it on the coronavirus. He'll just say Trump has led us to, say, currently 9% unemployment, because under Trump's watch, the economy's crashed because of coronavirus. Well, my response in my head to Joe Biden is, weren't you more in favor of more strict lockdowns? Wouldn't you be in favor, because the Democrats are typically in favor of longer, a slower reopening, and slower reopenings will inevitably lead to more of these jobs coming back slower. So it's kind of like, okay, I understand what you're saying. Technically, Trump's president, and technically those are the facts of the matter. But in the counterfactual world where you are in charge, I don't see why this should be any better. And there was one point where Trump pretty much said that to Joe Biden in like a very not astute sentence in a crude way, but he at least got the point of, what you're saying is flawed because the premise is dumb. He was able to like shoot that out there and crosstalk once, and I was like, whoa, he said something that actually is a okay point. That was the only okay point that I think was really made the whole debate, that benefited from crosstalk, that I picked up in my viewing. So that is valuable to some extent, and you won't see that if you don't have them intermingling. Obviously, if they actually were able to have a civil conversation that was free flowing, you would have points like that made. Although I'm not sure if Biden and Trump would be capable of anything, I guess, higher than what we did watch. Like if they try to sit down for a conversation, I can't imagine it not devolving into what we saw or something similar. So yeah, I think that covers what you just hit on. Did you have another thing you wanted to jump to, or did you want to bounce more off that?
So, I mean, for the most part, I think like 90% of what both of them said, or 90 to 95% of what both of them said, was nonsensical, or a lie, basically. Occasionally, one of them would make a good point. I thought Joe Biden, he had a couple good lines during the debate. So it was interesting when he said something to the effect of, Trump writes about the art of the deal, and China's perfected the art of the steal. I guess now, obviously, foreign policy and our relationship with China, it's a very complex issue, and you can't simplify it to one line. But I did see occasionally Joe Biden, he showed a little bit of wit in the situation. Unfortunately, very rarely, for the most part. And then Trump, occasionally he would make a good point, mentioning how Joe Biden created and supported the crime bill. So occasionally I did think that both of them made a point here or there that I would agree with. I might agree with them for different reasons, but I would have said that this or that statement was a correct statement. It's just unfortunate that almost everything they said was not even worth hearing. As you said, neither of them really had anything insightful to say. Neither of them really even knew what they were talking about. You know, I guess you could make the argument that maybe Joe Biden, at least in theory, has a bit more of a fleshed out ideology, whereas Trump's more of a Trump's more about just bettering his own circumstances. But I as I've said in previous podcasts, I don't like Joe Biden, and I obviously don't like Donald Trump. So this would not change. This hasn't changed my who I was gonna. I'm not going to, in other words, I'm sorry, I'm stuttering. I'm not going to make a decision on who to vote for based on this debate. And I would urge everyone else to do the same, because you can't make an informed decision based on one presidential debate. In fact, no matter who it is, because of the reasons that I've said, presidential debates are just nonsense anyway. But yeah, so I just I didn't really change my mind about either of the candidates. They didn't. If I did, I felt a little bit, or I disliked them a little more now than I did previously. But in terms of my my thought process, my in terms of whether I agreed or disagreed with both candidates, policy wise, this did not change my mind on any of that.
Well, and to play off that a little bit more too, it was completely unclear how they differentiated in policy on a lot of issues, even though they were supposed to be talking about issues. I still don't really understand how Joe Biden would have handled coronavirus any different from Trump, other than saying that he would recommend governors to have mask mandates, but he's admitted that he can't make those enforceable, right? So I'm not convinced that there's any reason, or at least they aren't informing me well, that Biden would have handled anything about the coronavirus any differently, other than they always talk about the China travel ban. That's what Trump always talks about. And I am under the impression Biden wouldn't have put that in any earlier. Now, I'm also not under the impression that that has even been that significant, because I don't know how much traffic that actually, stopped, or hypothetically would have stopped. So I walked away from the debate, and they talked about the coronavirus a lot, and I don't policy-wise see that they stand anywhere different, other than one of them symbolically wears a mask more often in public than the other person. And they imply that they have different personal beliefs about the coronavirus and the risk, but actually, in terms of policy, Biden has not said anything substantive about what he'd do differently than Trump, other than suggesting stricter things to governors, which he's admitted he doesn't really have authority over. He's talked about federal buildings requiring things that Trump might not have required, but that's like so small, because most of us don't work for the federal government or go to federal buildings very often. So I guess I was like, okay, well, a huge section of the debate is about this, and I don't even really understand that they're that different, because they will say that they'll do these. Like I'm clear on what I just told you, but I'm not clear that it actually would make a huge difference in the big picture. So when Biden's campaign tries to pin 200,000 people on Trump, I'm just sitting there like kind of befuddled. I'm like, how would have you made it zero? I don't really understand. And then so it just shows like how poorly they communicated anything. The other thing is when you mentioned the line about China, I'm not sure how Biden's China relations will be any different than Trump's, because a lot of the Democrat Party was more protectionist and more anti-free trade than the Republican Party until Trump came along. So just because Trump's in favor of tariffs, Democrats, have been a little reactionary and implied that they're, in favor of free trade or against those tariffs. But now when you hear maybe Elizabeth Warren talk or people like that, they'll imply they're for tariffs, but just different ones or smarter ones, and that Trump's are just used too bluntly. So it's not really clear that they even have any substantive policy disagreements in those realms. When it comes to healthcare, obviously Trump's not saying anything that is substantive. You don't have any idea what his plan is, because he doesn't have one, and the Republican plan shouldn't actually be a plan if the plan's supposed to be the free market. If the plan's supposed to be the free market, then you say we deregulate, because that's the plan. and the expectation is that they have a central planned thing, which isn't what they should be doing, but Trump just keeps insisting it. So obviously, he's not giving any new information or anything that's tangible. And then Biden continues to like kind of denounce everything him and his Biden-Bernie task force agreed on or came up with. So you don't really know where Biden stands because he doesn't want to adopt anything that could be controversial. Trump either says nothing of value or is at least in terms of speaking, almost identical to Biden at times. So I understand how you and I can have a conversation, both being avid political followers and knowing that, well, Biden will, on average, be more willing to sign in kinds of legislation that Trump would, on average, turn down. Like, we can say that and understand that's a real difference in policy. But when they're actually trying to communicate to us, they were doing a terrible job explaining to me how they're that different, other than the part on healthcare. The other two parts, I was just like, I understand you hate each other, but I don't understand the tangible things you do that are different. So I just thought that was kind of strange. And I think normally the candidates will do a better job sussing that out, but they will use talking points and they will use the most favorable interpretations of their plan. So they're actually giving you fake information because it's incomplete. And if you only get the fake, incomplete story that doesn't assess the real trade offs of every public policy in United States history, then you're essentially lying by omission. And that's what politicians do. Because, like you said, everything they do is a charade, including a debate, including however you put them up there. So I agree on generally being down and against the debates. I also am not sure a lot of things would be better because politicians are always going to put the most favorable view of their policies out there and not accept the trade-offs. Trump and Biden didn't even put out their favorable views because they don't even really know what their real policies will be because they're incompetent and they just got bogged down in calling each other stupid, right? Or idiots or clowns. That's why I think if we recorded this on a different day, maybe I'll be what's the word for it? I'll forecast a little bit. But the Kamala Harris Mike Pence debate is tonight, and I'm expecting that one to be the more pseudo substantive debate, where I'm expecting Mike Pence to go out there and I'm expecting him to say the benefits of tariffs, but leave out all the negatives of tariffs. And I'm expecting Kamala Harris to say, the benefits of her healthcare plan or the healthcare they want, and not mention any of the trade-offs, right? So normally that's the fake stuff you get that we didn't even get in this debate. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. I just threw a lot out there, and I know you got some thoughts.
So it's I don't want to get too bogged down into like individual cases. Like I think you and I, we disagree on all things such as like or things even related to the coronavirus, but I don't want to get too focused on that. But I guess what I want to say in response to what you just said is, and I guess maybe we agree at some level. I think the differences between Trump and Biden, they were poorly articulated in this debate. I think they do exist, though. So maybe that's where we disagree. Maybe you need to flesh that out for me more. But I do think, that there are differences between them. That there are obviously a lot of similarities as well. But I don't think we can say that they're interchangeable or that their policies, even on specific things such as coronavirus or China relations or trade and whatnot, I don't even think we can say that their policies would be interchangeable, even if both of them are just bad at explaining their policies. So Joe Biden, if elected president, is going to do traditional Democrat policies. It's going to be like Obama. It's going to be like Bill Clinton. It's basically in some sense going to be business as usual. Donald Trump, he's a bit more of a complex character in the sense that, generally speaking, he's done Republican policies. Sometimes he bucks Republican orthodoxy and does something a little differently. So he has changed the Democratic Party. Sorry, he has changed the Republican Party to a degree. But I don't think he's changed it dramatically. And I think, generally speaking, a lot of his policies have been Republican policies. So at one level, though, of course, you can make the argument that Republicans and Democrats, they have more, that they are very similar in the policies they fight for, or at least they agree on a lot of on the basics. They quibble about things like healthcare or gay marriage or whatnot, but generally speaking, they all have a similar ideology, and they're kind of they have a similar neoliberal ideology, which keeps both of them in power at some level. And of course, if you are a Orthodox Democrat or Orthodox Republican, in your mind, it's almost like, well, it's as long as one of us is in power, that's okay. But we can't allow, crazy libertarians. We can't allow wackos from the Green Party. It's only Democrats, Republicans. That's the only thing. Those are the only acceptable political parties in America. So maybe you'd want to flesh out a little bit more your point, because while it is true that Joe Biden and Donald Trump were not explaining themselves well at all, and in fact, I think in terms of like their public speaking skills, I think Donald Trump does a little better, just because he's very abrasive and outgoing. He might say a bunch of nonsense, but it's generally speaking, what he's saying. Joe Biden, he's not as good of a public speaker. Now, some might say part of it has to do with the stutter he has, so obviously he can't be faulted for that. And others say, well, it's just because he's getting older and he's not as sharp as he once was. He also can't be blamed for that. But yeah, so what I'm trying to say is I agree with you that the presidential debate itself did not illustrate the differences between Trump and Biden. But I guess I want to be clear as to whether you think there are actually differences between them at all, because I do think there are differences between them, even if the differences are a bit marginal.
Yeah, I was making a nuanced point of they are different, like in terms of especially specific fields, they're different. So like if you talk about healthcare, Trump will kind of just say stuff. He doesn't have any kind of plan. And as far as we know, no matter what the Democrats pass, if the Democrats had the House and Senate, Biden would sign on to it. It's unclear whether he's in favor of Medicare for all or whether he just wants to expand Obamacare. But regardless, I'm pretty confident he would sign in whatever was put in front of him if it was from a bunch of Democrats. So I think you can say that there's a substantive difference, even if that was poorly communicated in the debate. Now, then there's things like the coronavirus, where it's literally like the issue of the last 7 months. And this is kind of a conflict I've been having with hearing specifically Joe Biden and Trump talk about it, because that whole conversation about how Trump mishandled it is such a shallow conversation that has pretty much no easy to suss out depth. Because I guess what ends up happening is in all these stories, you end up hearing about specific states and how governors handle it. And you quickly realize that a lot of what is being done isn't done on a federal level. And a lot of the things that are related to the federal level, such as like, I guess, blocking certain countries from coming in, Trump did fairly early on. So like at the time that he was doing that ban on China, around then there was I think it was Nancy Pelosi was in her district telling people that they shouldn't be afraid to go shop in Chinatown, because that was before our lockdown, and that's when they were saying we don't want people afraid of the virus and attaching it to China. We don't want these businesses to be hurt. Please go. You can still go to all these types of stores in this neighborhood, and you shouldn't have to worry. And that was obviously before we locked down for weeks on end. So there isn't a lot of evidence that's clear to me that he handled it uniquely poorly when other people who were in the know in terms of, being elected leaders that had access to this type of information, they weren't, trying to push back early on. Then when we had the lockdowns, I mean, it's questionable how those succeeded and whatnot. But Biden hasn't communicated, well, the reason why we had this issue was because we should have done this lockdown for this specific amount of time in these regions. And it's not even clear that he would have the power to administer whatever plans he'd have. But he hasn't even brought up any plans, right? They just continue to say the president's incompetent. I don't disagree. So he handled it poorly. It's like, okay, well, what would handling it good look like? Nobody's communicated with that. It's a lot of symbolic attacks on Trump for, being hesitant to say things about masks or him like pushing back on scientists randomly in press conferences. But I'm not convinced that means 200,000 deaths are attributable to him. And nobody in the political sphere is making a really compelling case for why that should all be attributable to him. So you make that like a huge part of the debate and you make that a huge part of the conversation, but nobody is saying, well, obviously nobody would have died on our watch because we're smart. It's like, well, what would you would have done? They can't even work backwards knowing what we know now and undo it. So it's just strange that that's like a huge issue. And when Biden did his DNC speech, he kind of talked about the coronavirus and all the things he would do, and things either weren't in his jurisdiction, which they've admitted about like masks mandates. They've admitted that the federal government can't put those out there for every state and every locality to abide by, or it was things that have already been put into place or were done. So I'm just like, okay, well, here's a very controversial, polarizing issue, but Trump hasn't actually opened up everything, despite what it might be your impression. So they aren't different here. And then I would say something similar about China, because people like typical working class union like Democrats often push for protectionism at home to defend certain types of unions that work in certain industries. So even though Trump has done tariffs that have been criticized, I'm not convinced these Democrats would repeal them, and they haven't been hearkening about free trade internationally for years. So that there's like no reason for me to assume they're going to flip a 180 from Trump there. So although I agree, yeah, like say healthcare or maybe certain types of entitlement or welfare reforms, they could be very, very different. I'm not convinced on the coronavirus that they've handled it that much different from the executive position. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
I might be going down a rabbit hole here. So if after like I'd say a few sentences, you're just like, okay, we'll agree to disagree and move on. That's a fine statement, or that's a fine reply. But I just want to add something really quickly. I do think that Trump's response to coronavirus has been lackluster. And I don't hear correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't heard people say, well, if Joe Biden were president, there would be 0 deaths. I haven't heard that. Unfortunately, it's a virus. It's a virus we haven't dealt with before. There will be some deaths. No, even if we turn the clock back and supposedly did everything right, some people, unfortunately, would have died. I understand that. But my criticism of Trump is that he admitted this on tape, by the way. He consistently downplays the coronavirus. He has compared it to the flu. He makes all the regular, talking points about how, how shutting down is worse. Shutting down the country for a little while was in some ways like worse than just letting the virus kind of run its course at some level. I mean, he dragged his feet for a long time with the virus. He's not the only person who dragged their feet, of course. A lot of other powerful figures also dragged their feet. But he is the president of the United States, and so I would say he had a lot of influence in that regard. And so and it's possible that maybe a different Republican president could have even handled it better. I just think he was the wrong person to be president of the United States during a pandemic. I just don't think he knows what he's doing. I don't think he handled it well. He through his own foolishness, he literally got sick himself. Um, so, yeah, and I guess maybe I could add that, like, I understand what you're saying at one level. I mean, a lot of criticisms the Democrats make of Trump are hollow. They're just they don't have any substance to them. They're literally just, oh, Trump did something, therefore it's bad. So like I think I'm correcting for the, you know, if you want to call it the liberal spin or whatnot. I think I accept that quite a lot of times the Democrats unfairly criticize him, or just if they make criticisms of him, they're just being hypocrites or various things. Not all criticisms of Trump, especially from the Democrats, are legitimate. But I am convinced that the criticism that he handled it poorly is legitimate. So I'll let you respond here. Again, if we want to go down this rabbit hole, we can. But if you want to say a few words and then just refocus it on the debate itself, we can do that as well.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit more then on this this one, and I don't know if we'll go down a rabbit hole or not. I guess I would say, so I do respect that you're correcting and saying people would die either way. But like, if you do see any of the campaign ads that are like out there, because I use Pluto TV, which is like a great free app where you can like watch reruns of old stuff all the time, and they have ads, right? And I see Joe Biden ads all the time, and they pretty much openly cast all the deaths on Trump. And then if you go on Twitter, like, I mean, I'm talking about random people, but they are random people who are devout Democrat straight ticket voters, and they are attributing all the deaths to Donald Trump with no nuance. And I'm not saying that that's unique to either party, but I'm saying you hear people on cable news regularly attribute all these deaths to him as if somehow a person would have just managed it differently. Now, I understand what you're saying about how Trump downplayed it, and he admitted that, and there was that whole news cycle about that. But a lot of the information he had access to, people who are in like the Congress and the House had access to. Also, there was a scandal 4 or 5 months ago about a congressman selling off stock before the stock market tanked the first time because he had gone to like a meeting that was about coronavirus and he got concerned. Now, I'd also say a lot of the information was also pretty publicly accessible before they started worrying about it too. I'd already heard about the coronavirus well before Trump, had locked anything down, and that was I'd heard about it in like I guess December and January. But if he had taken action in December and January, there was no public support for it because it was still a niche thing. So I guess what I'm saying is the info was out there still. And then by the time Trump took his first action, that was literally when there were people who were of the left and of the right who were, but that was before we had lockdowns. The travel bans were before lockdowns, and that was before anybody was calling for lockdowns. So I just think like preventively, even if you say he knew about it earlier, it's like, well, I still don't think he should have acted on it earlier because the virus wasn't even here yet. So like, what were you going to do besides shut down, travel from China, which he did. So it's just like there are a lot of things that he's obviously said that are stupid when he's at those press conferences that are, completely dumb, and he does downplay it. But I'm not convinced that that's actually remotely nearly as impactful as people like to think it is. Now, you can argue that the fact that a bunch of people in America don't take it seriously makes the coronavirus worse on average. But I would say I know a lot of people who don't take it seriously, and it's not all Trump's fault. You can't attribute that whole population to Trump, because I know a lot of people who are pretty apolitical that are very negative on everything involving coronavirus restrictions. And, you got to remember that half the voting population age, half the people eligible to vote don't vote. So there are a lot of apolitical people who think it's all dumb, and it's not because Trump said something at a press conference. The people who watch those conferences or those clips are a fraction compared to the American public. So I just think that effect is kind of overplayed. So even if you had Mike Pence as president, and Mike Pence would have been like, symbolically wearing a mask whenever he's on camera just because it's setting the example, and he wouldn't be saying things that like comparing it to the flu, then, okay, that could have an effect. But I still think 3 months into it, a lot of people I know who aren't at risk personally would still say, I should be allowed to take my own risk. And they would still be pretty, anti what the left wing's pushing. And they would argue that perpetuates the current pandemic. So I'm not comfortable attributing a lot of what is attributed to Trump, because it's just people who are anti-left or anti this government I don't want to say overreach because that implies my position. But government stepping in at all in any capacity, whether you think it's justified or not, there are people that oppose that, and that's not just because Trump told them to. But I mean, I know there are a lot of people who just follow in Trump's lockstep. So if Trump did take the right position, they would follow along. So yeah, I guess I'd say that. And then the last thing is, it's hard to even claim that he handled it wrong for me when so much is unknown, right? So there have been a lot of things out there all about the ways it spreads and ways that we were wrong about how we thought it spread. And there's still a lot of debate over if people who are asymptomatic can really spread it, because the way that you would most easily get those germs out of your body if you had them have to do with symptoms like sneezing and coughing. So you're not actually, if they were asymptomatic, maybe you're not expelling the things that would actually get people sick. So even if you're a carrier, that risk may have been way overstated at a time. And unless we actually know how bad it was for all these reasons, we can't even know if our response has been proportionate or not. So it's hard to even evaluate it when there are so many basic elements, like the amount, like I was reading an article by Reason Magazine, and there are researchers who think that to hit what's that term, to where like herd immunity, to reach herd immunity, some people think you only need 20% of the people to get it. Some people think you'd need 65%, and it's because it's all based on a constant that is unknown, and the researchers can estimate it in a different way. Well, if herd immunity only needs to be 20%, then there's going to be a slew of policies that are way more efficient than the ones for 75%, but we don't know. So it's like I'm very hesitant to blame all the stuff that's happened, or even a sizable amount of it, on Trump. But this is a huge part of the Democratic Party platform, and they still haven't really talked to me about how they would have done it any different through the debate or not. So I guess the reason why this ties into the debate is because we watch an hour and a half debate who are two polarizing candidates, and people who support one will never support the other. But then like this main issue, I'm like, they aren't that different on that main issue, and it's frustrating to me. If you want to delve more into the coronavirus part, I'll let you get the last word. If you want to jump more into the debate, you can you can realign the conversation.
Yeah, so there's just one more thing I want to say about coronavirus policy, and then I'll, as you say, I'll go back to talking about the debate itself. I'm not convinced that the amount of deaths in the United States from coronavirus was inevitable. I think some deaths were inevitable, but I think Joe Biden, I'd have to check him on this statistic, but if I remember correctly in the debate, he said the U.S. has 4% of the world's population and 20% of the world's coronavirus deaths. Again, I'd have to check him on those particular statistics, but I'm just not convinced that all of the deaths, over 200,000 deaths, was inevitable.
Do you remember what Trump responded to Biden and said there, though? Because this is actually the other good moment of crosstalk in the whole debate.
You'll have to remind me of that now.
He said, okay, but do you think China, Russia, and India are actually correctly reporting the amount of coronavirus deaths in their country? And that's something that I've been thinking, because it's pretty clear, why would China have any interest in actually reporting real numbers? You can't trust things that come from Russia when Russia said they had the vaccine 3 months ago. So, and they're pretending like it's all good there. So it's like, well, when Biden can lay out those stats, it's like, well, actually global reporting on coronavirus in authoritarian countries aren't actually to be trusted. Like, why would we trust China or North Korea on it? So I just wanted to make that point, because, well, why would you trust China on how many coronavirus deaths have happened? They have every interest to downplay how bad it was there, and it's in their authoritarian interest to make it look like they handled it well. Like, there's no reason to trust their numbers. They've been lied about economic statistics for decades. This is something China's known to do for economics, let alone people dying from a disease that they could hypothetically lock down.
I don't know. I just, when I hear that, I hear whataboutism, because at some level, it doesn't matter to me if China did the worst in the whole world. What matters to me, I'm a U.S. citizen, so at some level, whether I like it or not, this country matters more to me than other countries. And I'm just not convinced that over 200,000 deaths was inevitable. We can quibble about whether data from Russia or China or India is correct, but the calculation one has to make is is the amount of coronavirus deaths that happened in the United States, was that inevitable, or could we have done policies to where the number of deaths we have right now were significantly less? And I make the calculation: we could have done policies which we could have implemented policies which in which much less than over 200,000 people died from coronavirus. Some other people make very different calculations. I can't prove that, but based on what I've read and how I've thought about it, that's the conclusion I've come to. As Trump says, one of the few correct things he says is one death is too much. Of course, one death is too much. But I don't think that the amount of deaths in the United States, however they compare to other countries' deaths, was inevitable.
Yeah. I have to jump in though a little bit. I guess the reason why I interrupted with that was just because the idea of like the U.S. makes up this proportion of the world, but they make up this proportion of coronavirus deaths that's outsized. Like that point though, like Trump's response undercuts it, because he's saying, okay, but if you've systematically undercut I'm not saying it means it's justified how many people died in the United States. I'm saying it undercuts that statistic, because if it's systematically underreported in China, which has a huge population, then we don't know the real percentage of the world's coronavirus deaths. So you can't accurately say we make up an oversized portion if giant countries like China and India are lying. Now, aside from that point, I would say this is why the per capita, looking at per capita data is informative. And then when you look at the per capita data, you see a lot of pseudo intellectual analysis on CNN, where they look at the whole United States instead of breaking it down into regions. And then you can see some areas drastically underperform and some drastically overperform, just like different parts of Europe drastically underperform, like Rome, and not Rome, Italy, and some parts drastically overperform. And then you can look at the states and maybe suss out what actually happened. So I think it's all very complex. That's why I think it's weird when you hear Joe Biden say a throwaway line that's a statistic, and I'm like, well, that statistic means nothing. There are maybe valuable per capita statistics that are relevant. I mean, but I do accept your broader point. Well, there's no reason to assume 200,000 people is inevitable. That's fine. I'll accept that. Because I don't really know what would be inevitable. It's so counterfactual. I don't even know how to start to think about. But I guess that way of framing it by Biden completely is it's using statistics in a way that are invalid. It's like almost a made up statistic because you can't validate the information in it. And there are ways to be very technical with statistics and break it down and use like per capita basis to compare different regions to the United States. And then you have to think, well, is it even good to look at the US as a whole? What does that mean? Why would we do that when New York was uniquely bad, New Jersey was uniquely bad? And how much to say did Trump have over New York? Why was New York this bad? Like, there are all these questions that are important, but you can't sum it up with that one stat that's already flawed. And there are a lot of stats that are flawed, and they don't add context because the discourse is so low. So yeah, I think your point stands. I wasn't trying to defend Trump. I'm not voting for him. I'm more saying, yeah, you're right. A lot of deaths probably weren't inevitable, but I'm also saying a lot of the stats you'll see the Democrats throw out there, there's no reason to even assume it's a good statistics to use when understanding how well our country handled it, because there's a lot of data that's important in the equation. Like when coronavirus is so skewed towards people of a certain age, and you're looking at per capita data, is it even fair to compare Italy with the United States? Because Italy might have a much higher median age. So then it's like, well, maybe Italy didn't handle it that much worse. They just have way higher mortality rates because that age group is systematically, more vulnerable to coronavirus. And it's like, whoa, that's possible. So why don't we have to equalize it by age and the mortality rates? Like, there are all these ways to look at data that are important. And by talking about it in like this political context that we see like in the debates, it's so trivializing that it's dumbfounding to me, because it makes the stats not matter by using them without giving good context. And that's why I see all over the news in general too, because it appeals to people who are loosely paying attention. I guess that's more of a rant about data interpretation than anything. I think your general point still stands, and I wasn't trying to refute it. So yeah, I don't know. That is just food for thought, I guess, in general, and I wanted to air it out there if anybody, wants to think more about how we should think about the coronavirus as a whole when we look at data.
Maybe we should do like a whole episode on COVID, because we could probably talk about that for an hour as well.
Well, you got me to say all that, and I didn't even talk about like how that interacts with my political philosophy.
I'll just add that, like, I remember watching. So everyone knows Chris Wallace was the moderator, and I was watching an old interview with that Chris Wallace did with the president a while back, and Chris Wallace he had a particular graph from, I think, was it the European CDC or something like that, which showed that the United States wasn't doing very well coronavirus-wise. And what did Trump do? He literally called over one of his staff members, like, "Yeah, give me that graph over there. Give me that graph. Hey, look at this. Look at this. Look at America's doing great. America's doing great." So yeah, that's another conversation we could have about like statistical analysis and how statistics can be abused or manipulated to fit wildly different conclusions. But to try to get back to the broader conversation on the debate. Actually, there's this idea that I kind of wanted to float with you, or to float with you, an idea that I wanted to mention to you, and I'm just curious your response. I don't know if you saw this. It was a poll, I think, that came out. So people are thinking that because of the presidential debate was such a disaster that the rules need to be changed, or like something needs to be changed. Another thing people are wondering is maybe a different moderator. Because, I mean, generally speaking, I think Chris Wallace did an okay job. I don't think he did as good as he could have. And he definitely let both men, he definitely let it get away from him. He wasn't very good at grounding the debate. It must be said. But a poll came out, and I don't remember the exact number, but I think 69% of Americans said that they want Joe Rogan to host a presidential debate. And that's an interesting thought to me. I'm not sure, to be honest, that I would want him to host a presidential debate. But it's interesting to kind of think about, I guess, both like who would be a good moderator and also just about the nature of the moderator itself. Because, of course, Joe Rogan's podcast is all about having just honest conversations with people for 3 hours, unscripted, unedited. And I guess some people might think to themselves, well, Joe Rogan might, bring out the humanity in both men and actually get them to show their true colors. And of course, he's just probably the most popular, if not one of the most popular podcasters ever. And so that's just a popularity factor of, people like Joe Rogan, he should do it. So I'm just curious, actually, what would you say about the possibility of a Joe Rogan moderating the debates? It probably wouldn't happen, I'm guessing, just because Joe Rogan did say he'd rather vote for Trump over Biden because he thinks Biden's in cognitive decline. But if that were possible, like if both camps agreed to it, what would you say? Do you think that's a good idea? Do you not care about that idea? What's your take on that?
So, okay. So I'm kind of split a little bit. I think it would actually have, okay, so how would I want to frame this? So imagine you had like Obama Romney interviewed by Rogan. I actually can imagine that being substantive because they wouldn't be yelling at each other while they were answering. And Joe Rogan likes to play devil's advocate, but if the moderator's asking you a question and if it's in Joe Rogan's like place where you have to give a long form answer and you can't dodge and hope the audience claps, right? You have to kind of answer it. So what I would imagine is you'd have like he'd ask Obama a question and then Rogan would be like, okay, but like what about all the people who say this? And when Romney tries to say that in crosstalk, right, it can get dismissed because he's just a Republican. But if Rogan says it, then you can, he would actually have to answer it. So you might get a level of sophistication, or at least of pseudo sophistication, where they try to at least address counter arguments to some extent, and then you could have like a more long form period, and it would be casual, so it'd just be interesting to watch. Now you have Trump and Biden, I'm not convinced either of them could make an honest defense of their policies if they were confronted with genuine counter arguments in like an intellectually satisfying way, because I'm not confident Biden really knows even the policies he's defending. He knows the range of the spectrum of the policies he's defending, but a lot of the specific arguments would be like made, on the margin. So so right now, if Rogan tried to be like, okay, Biden, I'm pretty sure you're for universal health care, but what about people who'd say this? Biden is kind of like, I'm just, for like more than now, but like, whatever. I don't know what they'll give me in the Senate. And he kind of denies being pro universal health care. So you can't even like really pin him down on his positions enough to even ask him a follow up question. So, and then Trump, like, you can't, all Trump does is assert things, right? He doesn't ever put together a logical string of thoughts. He doesn't go like and it's not that he's uniquely stupid. It's just the way that he makes his point isn't via reason. And that's fine if he's arguing for the right policies. I couldn't care less how he's stating it in a stump speech, but he's not appealing to reason when he makes the argument in a stump speech. He asserts a fact, and then he asserts the solution. So if Rogan comes in and he's like, well, I don't think that will fix it because of this reason and this reason, what would you say of people who like are kind of skeptical? He would just kind of imply, well, you're not really like worried about law and order, right? He would just like, maybe he would reassert the first thing and then reassert the second thing. So I'm not convinced there would be any ground to be made, or there'd be anything to dig into for that conversation to be had. Now, in general, if it was like, normal politics and you had like Obama, McCain, or Obama Romney, like, yeah, that could be interesting. You could actually get like an honest conversation a little deeper. But I don't, and it's not going to happen either. They have no interest in having them out there for that long. It would also be cool to see them both, though, in like a 4-hour conversation, because we saw Biden early on in the debate. He wasn't looking good. That's why I thought the first 30 minutes of the debate was so entertaining, was Chris Wallace hadn't started stepping in yet. So Trump was really getting in Biden's head, knocking him off his train of thought, and then he would just start slurring his words and stuttering, and it was laughable. He was like hardly a person up there. But fortunately for Biden, he really recovered in that last hour. But could Biden really recover if somebody like Joe Rogan was asking him questions that would make him think for a 3-hour period of time in an environment where it's not okay to fall back on talking points? And it's like, not really. So to some extent, I would want to see how badly that breaks Biden, just as like a mental test, and that could be entertaining. But yeah, I did hear about that, and it was like fascinating at first. And Trump did retweet it, and Trump said that he was down. So I'm kind of hoping that there's like a not zero chance that like Trump gets like a phone interview by Rogan for maybe 45 minutes. That would be crazy if that came out. I would love to hear that. But I don't see that debate happening. Are you good on that point? Or sure? Okay. So one thing that
I did want to mention a little more about that. Sorry.
Okay, go for it.
Well, I don't know. They're just kind of two broad points. Well, a couple broad points I just want to mention, maybe three. So I guess like you, I am a little torn on it in some sense. So at one level, like Joe Rogan, even though he's an incredibly wealthy man, he's like a very down-to-earth guy. And, he's also not somebody who's, a diehard Republican or a diehard Democrat. I guess maybe you could say he's a libertarian of sorts, although he did support Bernie in 2016. And he is critical of like Dave Rubin-esque libertarianism. But he's also critical of a lot of left-wing stuff, cancel culture, and he's part of the intellectual dark web and all that. So it's, at some level, I could almost understand why someone might want Rogan, because he's almost like a stand-in for the average guy, for the average person. It's like, okay, here I am. I'm just a comedian and a podcaster. Explain to me why you should why I should vote for you, and then maybe like if that will help people kind of like see, well, that would help people watching like maybe come to their own conclusion. But I guess I have to say I'm not really completely gung-ho about the idea. And some people might say this sounds elitist. I don't think it is, and I don't mean to make it to sound that way. But I do think a moderator of a presidential debate should be more politically educated. Joe Rogan's not an unintelligent guy. I'm just not. I'm not sure he would be asking the right questions that perhaps a moderator should. Not because he's not intelligent, but just because politics isn't his main thing. He's a podcaster. He's a comedian. He does UFC commentary, and he's good at all those things, and everyone agrees he's good at all those things. But he's not. Politics isn't his primary focus, and so it's like someone like Chris Wallace, who there's plenty of reasons to criticize Chris Wallace, but he does. He focuses on politics and reports on politics and talks about politics for a living. And so I guess I would prefer some sort of journalist or political commentator, or maybe even a politician, someone who's like, who knows the political milieu, who knows a lot about politics and different policies and can play devil's advocate like far more than Joe Rogan could. Maybe an academic of sorts. I would say that even though I really respect Joe Rogan and I like his podcast a lot, I would prefer somebody more politically inclined to be a moderator if we accept the format of a moderator and two debaters. And of course, some people say you don't even need a moderator, or as I said earlier, it's like maybe you just have an open forum or just a general conversation between two people and only have a third person there just to make sure that they're mildly civil and they're on topic. So I think there's I guess the thing that I find interesting about proposing Joe Rogan as moderator is just because it helps us think more about sort of, if we're going to have presidential debates, what's going to be the form of the presidential debates? Because I think that's probably the most important question. Because like I said at the beginning of this podcast, I'm not opposed to presidential debates in principle, but I think the way they are put on is far less about substance and far more about entertainment. And I would want a presidential debate with a lot of substance. I want to hear Joe Biden and Donald Trump explain to me why their trade policies are the way they are, why they think about healthcare the way they do. That's what I want to hear. I don't want to hear Trump making cheap shots about Beau Biden's past. Because that's just not helpful. That doesn't help me decide who I should vote for. It doesn't help anyone decide who he or she should vote for. It's just two people trying to get the upper hand, trying to look the best in the conversation or in the debate itself, trying to score points, basically. And I actually had an earlier point and I forgot it, but now I remember it. And so this might be a good time to, I guess, for us to give like our kind of closing thoughts about the debate. But I went into the debate pretty certain that Donald Trump would win the debate. And by that, I just mean I thought that because Trump generally has better speaking skills than Biden, I just thought that he would come out looking better than Joe Biden. Again, not because of he has better policies, but just because he's a pretty good public speaker. And Joe Biden just isn't a very good public speaker. But the interesting thing is I came out of that debate with thinking that neither of them was the winner or the loser. I think that they were both the losers, basically, of that debate. Neither of them really came out looking better than the other. And as I said, I found myself respecting both of them a little bit less. And that's really, like, I think that's probably almost what people find shocking about the debate. Like, at some level, I think people kind of being shocked about it, it shows they have too much. They're being like too optimistic, or they're like they think that presidential debates really matter a lot more than they should. But I think if I'm like trying to understand from other people's perspective, it's like, okay, what is so like strange about this debate? And I'm guessing it is because, generally speaking, in a debate, you can say, well, this person kind of came out looking better, or maybe sounded like this person made a bit more sense. And that was not true in this debate, from my perspective, at least. Neither candidate came out to me, or neither candidate stood out to me as like the winner of the debate, or that either candidate was really making more sense than the other. So yeah, that would be my synopsis of the, like, if anyone asks me the question, like, who won, my answer is neither of them won.
So I'll half answer it, and I'll half like use this as a tool to make my, I guess, closing thoughts on it. As the debate happened, I was texting you, and I was filled with unbridled optimism about our country, because I was certain that the event I was watching was going to wake people up, because it was so bad on every front. And it was kind of like how I was saying at the beginning of this episode, they couldn't even have the facade of like decency or like pseudo intellectual rhetoric, even if they would be dishonest. And that's what I think historically the candidates have had, is this, like, they'll be misleading because they won't honestly confront trade-offs, but they would make it sound academic. They would cite things that are like from, they would cite a sentence from a study maybe, but this was just garbage flinging. And a lot of people walked away from it just seeing everything degraded. And it was two people who weren't very smart. I'm sure most of America that watched it thought they were smarter than the people they're watching debate. And I'm sure a lot of people, anybody who's remotely academic, thought they could be making better points than the person that they're probably going to vote for. So that's why, as I mentioned, that focus group, people don't really want to vote for either if they were undecided. I walked in, I guess I was buying the media narrative of Biden's going to melt down. He kind of did in the beginning. I was hoping he'd melt down more. And I knew the media narrative after was, oh, Biden won because he didn't lose. I think the common wisdom is nobody really won, which means Biden won because Trump needed to win. I don't think any of that matters. I think I won because it really is going to wake people up to not only how bad these candidates are, but how kind of stupid a lot of these things are. Because if you watch that debate and you start putting certain pieces together, like about how, well, even though Trump, talks like this, he at least does some policies I like. But then if you keep following that thread to, well, look, these guys are yelling at each other, but they both complain about the other person's China policy, but they don't even have a clear China policy, they're going to realize a lot of the stuff they're against is just the establishment position, like on wars and stuff like that. Trump was anti-war, but it didn't really matter. He kind of didn't hold back much. Not a lot's changed on the foreign policy front. I think it's one of these events that'll make people be like, whoa, what is going on, in a way that makes them down on democracy, or at least down on the two-party system. And the more we have people opt out, and the more we have people kind of say, you guys don't truly represent me, the more you indirectly start pumping into, like, I guess, a general libertarian ethic of, I don't expect the government to have my best interests because they clearly don't advocate for my views, no matter who wins. They clearly perpetuate themselves, and they don't really care about me as the individual. So I think that's the general theme for anybody who's kind of shook by this, in the same way that, like, a lot of people were kind of woken up by Ron Paul in 2008. I think a lot of people who are kind of remotely leaning a candidate could have walked away kind of dumbfounded. And I know a lot of people, it looks like it hasn't shook his general support, but by shaking people's general, I guess, faith in the in both the parties, I think that's for the greater good, I guess, in the short term. So that's why I had unbridled optimism. I was like, I think this is the moment that somebody should capitalize on and say, see, clearly democracy in our country right now isn't working, and the ways people should argue it should work won't actually fix it, because there are other reasons why it doesn't work. and these things are maybe endemic to democracy. That's the kind of way I'd jump into a conversation on democracy where we could have bitter disagreements. But I even think if we had that conversation, we've done it before, it would just be a different jumping off point. So I don't think we even need to go down that road unless you want to do a quick rebuttal. But that was kind of my takeaway. I don't know. I like how bad it was because it was so clear to me that it was a failure that it was hard for me to imagine anybody walking away and being as excited to vote for who they were going to vote for. Because now, like before, when I see the signs, the Trump signs and the Biden signs, I'd cringe a little bit. I'd be like, you're really supporting that person like that heavily. But now I know that if they watch the debates, they still have that sign up, even after watching those abysmal performances on both sides. And it's clear that it's hard to stand for either candidate, and it's only easy to stand opposed to the other one. And I think that got even more indefensible to say you're like a Biden fan and not just against Trump. So that's a win, at least to some degree. Did you want to add anything? Yeah, go for it.
I think I accidentally turned my mic on a few minutes before you finished, so I hope there wasn't too much background noise or anything. But as I said, I'm not. I mean, I did say it was incredibly painful to watch because it was incredibly painful to watch, but it wasn't incredibly painful to watch for me because I became disillusioned with democracy, or I became disillusioned with the two-party system. I had no faith. I don't have any faith in the two-party system as a jumping off point. So there was no faith for me to lose in this respect.
I wasn't talking about people like you though. I'm talking about the people who are vaguely disgusted with Trump and they're like, oh, I'll vote Biden, I guess.
No, I know. I'm just giving my perspective. Now I know you weren't talking about me specifically. But from my perspective, I had no faith to lose in the two-party system.
Mm-hmm.
I think the system we have is abysmal. And at some level, I can agree with you and be hopeful in the sense that disillusionment with the current system can allow for a better system, a new system to be constructed in its place. You and I, of course, disagree on what we would want to be constructed in its place, or just in your case, nothing. But so, this is just, I see this two-party system. It's just muddling along. Even though everyone's beginning to hate it, Democrats and Republicans alike, everyone's beginning to hate it. It's just muddling along. I don't see it going away, at least in the near future. Hopefully, as I said, that changes can be made down the road sometime, and I hope this is like the beginning of when people start to realize what changes could be made or should be made. And then I also just want to add that I don't know if I've in a previous podcast I might have already given my election prediction. So forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but I've already come to the conclusion, and it's not the election day yet. Something could happen to completely change this, but based on what I know now, I think Biden's going to win. I think Trump's going to be a one-term president. He's floundering. He dropped the ball way too many times. Whether you agree with him or disagree with him, he just so many things he could have done differently to better his chances of getting reelected. And with the coronavirus and with the economic recession that's been going on, and when these things happen, again, for better or worse, people blame who's ever in power. So I think Biden's going to win. It's going to be business as usual. That'll be interesting, actually, because we started this podcast, or when we started this podcast, it was already a couple years into the Trump presidency. And so when Biden becomes president, you'll get to hear me criticize a Democratic president because there's plenty to criticize the Democrats for. If we had been recording when Obama was president, I would have been criticizing Obama on every podcast we had. So this will give the audience a chance. If Biden wins, it would give the audience a chance to see me in my attack mode of the party that I think is at least at some level salvageable, or the party that at least I agree with more than the other party. I don't know if you have any thoughts on like just the general what's going to happen election wise, but that's what I think is going to happen.
Yeah, I'm not too concerned about the election in the sense that I only see things getting worse in terms of government and not better unless we have people waking up that become more activated against government in general, and there's any kind of like libertarian movement. Now, what I am hopeful for is I'm hoping that more ways to indirectly secede from government become available, and we've already seen those with a lot of, and we don't talk about them often, but like I remember like maybe 6 months ago I was talking to you about how 3D printing's gotten good enough so people are printing like 80% of a gun on a printer, right? We're seeing things like that happen. We're seeing things like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies becoming more prominent. We're seeing a lot of ways people have found to work around governments. And if Trump wins, he's going to be just as authoritarian as he's been. I don't agree with how the left thinks he's authoritarian. I think he's been authoritarian in a lot of different ways. And if Biden wins, it's going to be a lot of worse stuff in a bunch of industries in terms of regulations. So I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of ways that people find to work around those things, regardless of who's president. And I'm looking forward to capitalizing them how I can, because no matter who's in charge, they work for the government and the government's violent. So I don't like them. And then I'm looking forward to hearing you criticize Biden, and then I'll get really triggered because you'll criticize him for reasons that I think you're wrong on. So that'll be fun, and we'll tackle that when it comes up. So yeah, I think we covered that plenty. We didn't even get into my. I guess I had probably a 5-minute monologue I go on about the implications of democracy as a whole, and how this was actually it wasn't even that bad. This debate was bad, and how democracy will always be a low form of discourse inherently. Because I know we disagree on that, so it'd be fun for me to just say it all and say your position for you. Because I probably could do it okay, and then you'd have 8 criticisms. But that's fine. We'll do that another day. So I hope you guys enjoyed hearing us talk about how we wasted an hour and a half of our lives on the debate, because that's always fun. I'm looking forward to doing it 2 more times if they do 2 more debates. I hope you got something of substance out of this. I'm proud of how I argued in favor of looking at statistics more carefully, because I figure that's the easiest way for the pseudo-intellectual people who run media organizations to mislead people, by dropping a favorable statistic when there's probably 8 better ones, or at least 8 you should consider instead of just 1. So hopefully that's some food for thought in general. So I hope you guys enjoy. You can find our whole backlog of podcasts on any podcatcher, or find us on YouTube under the Anti-Philosopher, and then by searching Beyond Talking Points, and then you can see our faces as we argue or want to argue and jump in, but we hold ourselves back. You could also see my cat jump on my desk in the background early on in this episode. That was very pleasant. So thanks for tuning in, guys, and signing off. It's Matt and Matt.